The silence in the house was never a peaceful one. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against Eleanor's chest every time she stepped out of her bedroom. At 72, Eleanor had learned that silence could be a weapon, especially when wielded by her daughter-in-law Clara. For 3 years, since the death of her husband Arthur, Eleanor had lived in the shadow of her own home. A Victorian estate on the edge of the city that she and Arthur had spent 40 years restoring. Now the polish on the banisters felt cold, and the air in the hallways smelled of Clara's expensive, clinical-scented candles, masking the ghost of Eleanor's lavender perfume. Tonight, however, Eleanor didn't care about the coldness of the house. She sat at her small mahogany vanity, the only piece of furniture Clara hadn't insisted on replacing with modern, minimalist alternatives. On the velvet surface sat a weathered silk-lined box. Inside lay the jade of the Valerius family. It was a necklace of breathtaking craftsmanship. The jade stones were deep forest green orbs, translucent when held to the light, connected by intricate gold filigree that looked like frozen vines. It had survived wars, migrations, and the slow, eroding march of time. It had been placed around Eleanor's neck by her mother-in-law on her own wedding day, a gesture of acceptance and love. Now tomorrow, it would belong to Sarah. Sarah, her granddaughter, was the only spark of warmth left in Eleanor's world. Unlike her father, Mark, who had grown distant and occupied by the high-pressure demands of his corporate job and Clara's social ambitions, Sarah still saw Eleanor. She still visited the old room, to listen to stories of the past. Tomorrow was Sarah's wedding, and Eleanor had promised her the jade. "It's not just a piece of jewelry, Sarah," Eleanor had whispered to her a week ago. "It's a promise that no matter how much the world changes, our family stays rooted. It's our resilience." As Eleanor ran a soft cloth over the stones, the door to her room creaked open. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels on the hardwood floor acted as Clara's herald. "Still obsessing over that old thing, Mother?" Clara's voice was smooth, like silk over a blade. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharp and perfectly tailored in a cream-colored lounge suit. She looked like the cover of a luxury magazine, and she knew it. Eleanor didn't look up. "It's not an old thing, Clara. It's the tradition. It's what Sarah expects." Clara walked into the room, her eyes locking onto the green glow of the jade. There was a hunger in her gaze that she didn't bother to hide. "Expectations can be heavy. Don't you think it's a bit much for a modern wedding? Sarah is wearing a Varawang. That heavy, clunky green is going to clash with the minimalist aesthetic. I've already picked out a diamond pendant for her. Something sleek. Something that says today, not 19th century." Eleanor felt a familiar spark of defiance in her gut. "The jade stays. It is her birthright. I've already told her." Clara let out a short, dry laugh, moving closer to the vanity. She reached out a hand, her long, manicured nails hovering near the necklace. "You're so sentimental, Eleanor. It's almost a weakness. You cling to these objects as if they give you power. But look around. This house, the guest list for tomorrow, the life Mark and I have built. None of it was built on tradition. It was built on knowing when to let go of the old to make room for the new. Is that what you call it?" Eleanor turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting Clara's in the mirror. "Letting go? Or is it erasing?" Clara's smile didn't falter, but her eyes darkened. "Call it what you want. But Sarah is my daughter, and I won't have her looking like a museum exhibit on the most important day of her life. You're becoming quite stubborn in your old age, Mother. Mark is worried about you. He thinks the confusion is setting in. You've been forgetting things lately. The stove, the back door, your medication." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. She knew exactly what Clara was doing. For months, Eleanor would find the stove burner on when she hadn't touched it. She would find her front door unlocked in the middle of the night. She knew she wasn't forgetting. She knew Clara was planting the seeds of dementia in Mark's mind, preparing the soil for the day they would move Eleanor out of the house and into a care facility. "I remember everything perfectly, Clara," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I remember the day you married my son, and told me you'd cherish this family. I remember the way you looked at this house not as a home, but as an asset. And I remember that this necklace belongs to the Valerius bloodline, A line you only joined by name. The insult hit its mark. Clara's posture stiffened. She leaned down, her face inches from Eleanor's. Bloodlines are just biology, Eleanor. Control is what matters. Tomorrow, Sarah will wear what I choose. And you will sit in the pews and play the part of the doting, slightly confused grandmother. Don't make me remind Mark why we had to look into those assisted living brochures last week. Clara turned on her heel and marched out, the click of her heels echoing like a countdown. Eleanor sat in the silence that followed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked down at the jade. It felt heavier now, as if it were absorbing the tension in the room. She knew Clara wasn't just talking about fashion. Clara hated the necklace because it represented a history she couldn't buy and a bond she couldn't break. Slowly, Eleanor closed the velvet box. She felt a deep, gnawing sense of unease. She had seen the look in Clara's eyes. The look of a predator who had finally tired of the hunt and was ready for the kill. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened garden. The old oak trees swayed in the wind, their roots deep in the soil, unmoved by the storm. I won't let her, Eleanor whispered to the glass. I won't let her break the chain. But as she placed the box back into her vanity drawer and turned off the light, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The house felt different tonight. The shadows seemed longer, reaching toward her. She climbed into bed, her mind racing with 1,000 what-ifs. She didn't know that just down the hall, in the glow of a tablet screen, Clara was looking at the current market value of grade A imperial jade. She didn't know that a plan had already been set in motion. A plan that didn't just involve a wedding, but a final erasure of the woman who stood in Clara's way. The tradition wasn't just under threat. It was already being dismantled, brick by brick, stone by stone. And as Eleanor finally fell into a fitful sleep, the velvet box sat in the drawer, a silent witness to the betrayal that was about to unfold in the dark. The house was never truly still after midnight. It hummed with the mechanical pulse of the air conditioning and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. But for Eleanor, the silence of the night was always thin, like a veil that could be torn by the slightest breath. She lay in bed, her eyes closed but her mind vibrating with the residue of her confrontation with Clara. The words assisted living echoed in the chambers of her heart, a cold threat that felt more like a sentence than a suggestion. Outside, a branch scraped against the windowpane, a skeletal finger tapping on glass. Eleanor's breathing was shallow. She was waiting. She didn't know for what, but the instinct that had kept her sharp through decades of business and family turmoil was screaming. Then she heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the whisper of a floorboard protesting under a careful weight. It was the distinct, metallic clink of a door handle being turned with excruciating slowness. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't open her eyes. She practiced the rhythmic, heavy breathing of a woman lost in the depths of a sedative-induced sleep. The door to her bedroom groaned as it opened. A sliver of light from the hallway dissected the darkness of the room, casting a long, distorted shadow across the floral wallpaper. The shadow moved, creeping toward the mahogany vanity where the jade necklace sat in its velvet tomb. Through the veil of her eyelashes, Eleanor watched. It was Clara. She was still dressed in her cream lounge suit, but she had kicked off her heels. She moved with a predator's grace, her silhouette illuminated by the dim amber glow of the nightlight in the hall. Clara didn't glance at the bed. Her focus was singular, obsessive. She reached the vanity and paused, her hand hovering over the drawer. Eleanor felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal urge to spring up and scream, to catch the thief in the act. But she stayed frozen. To reveal herself now was to lose the only advantage she had, the element of surprise. She needed to see how far Clara would go. With a click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room, the drawer opened. Clara pulled out the silk-lined box. She opened it, and for a second, the faint light caught the deep, emerald soul of the jade. Clara's expression was unreadable, not one of guilt, but of cold, calculated triumph. Then, Clara reached into the deep pocket of her tunic and pulled out an identical box. Eleanor's blood ran cold. This wasn't a sudden impulse. This was a choreographed execution. Clara swapped the boxes. She opened the second one just enough to ensure the replacement was positioned correctly. The fake necklace was a masterpiece of deception. Crafted from high-density acrylic and coated in a lacquer that mimicked the oily luster of real jade. To a casual observer, or a distracted granddaughter on a hectic wedding morning, it would pass. But it lacked the soul. It lacked the weight of 100 years of history. Clara closed the drawer softly. She tucked the real jade into her pocket, her hand lingering on the fabric as if she could already feel the cash it would generate. "You won't need this where you're going, Mother," Clara whispered. The voice was barely a breath, but it carried a chilling finality. "This pays for my Mediterranean cruise. Consider it a convenience fee for dealing with you all these years." Clara turned and retreated, closing the door with a soft thud that felt like the lid of a coffin. The moment the door latched, Eleanor sat bolt upright. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her first instinct was to run to the hallway, to tackle Clara, to demand her birthright back. But then she remembered Mark. She remembered the way he looked at her during dinner, the pity, the doubt. If she accused Clara now, Clara would simply hide the necklace, call Mark, and point to Eleanor's manic episode as proof that she was no longer fit to live alone. Eleanor stood up, her legs trembling. She walked to the vanity and opened the drawer. She touched the fake stones. They were warm, too warm. Real jade stayed cold, a piece of the earth's frozen heart. This was plastic. This was a lie. She sank into her chair, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The moonlight made her look fragile, a ghost of the woman she used to be. For a moment, she felt the crushing weight of defeat. Clara had everything. The house, the influence over Mark, and now the heirloom. But then, Eleanor's eyes fell on the small, black decorative box tucked behind her perfume bottles. It was a digital clock, or so it appeared. It was a gift from an old friend who had gone into private security years ago. "For a woman living alone," he had said, "knowledge is better than a deadbolt." Eleanor reached out and pressed a hidden button on the side of the clock. A tiny blue light flickered once, then turned steady. She remembered the afternoon 3 weeks ago when she had spent 4 hours carefully hiding the pinhole lens. She had seen the way Clara looked at her jewelry before. She had noticed the disappearing silver spoons. She had prepared for a theft, but she hadn't prepared for a betrayal this surgical. She picked up her smartphone from the nightstand. Her fingers, usually stiff with arthritis, moved with a sudden icy precision. She opened an app she had hidden in a folder labeled Weather. There it was. The infrared footage was crystal clear. It showed Clara entering the room. It showed the swap. It captured the whispered words about the Mediterranean cruise. It was a digital confession, etched in pixels. Eleanor felt a strange, cold calm wash over her. The fear was gone, replaced by a crystalline anger. Clara thought she was playing a game against a dying lamp, a flickering light that was easy to blow out. She didn't realize she was in a room with a woman who had built an empire before Clara had learned to walk in heels. Eleanor didn't call the police. She didn't wake Mark. Instead, she lay back down in bed and pulled the covers up to her chin. She stared at the ceiling, watching the shadows of the trees dance. She thought about the pawn shop receipt she had seen tucked into Clara's planner earlier that week. A valuation for antique green stones. Clara was greedy, but she was also impatient. She wouldn't keep the jade in the house. She would move it quickly, perhaps as early as tomorrow morning before the ceremony, to ensure the trail was cold. "Go ahead, Clara," Eleanor whispered into the darkness. "Sell the past. But you've forgotten one thing about traditions." Eleanor closed her eyes, a grim smile touching her lips. "They only break if you let them fall. And I am still holding on." In the room next door, she heard the muffled sound of Clara laughing, a bright, victorious sound. Eleanor let her enjoy it. It was the laughter of someone who thought they had won the war when they had only stolen a single flag. Tomorrow, the wedding would begin. The guests would arrive. The tradition would be presented. And Eleanor would be ready to turn the theater of the wedding into a courtroom of the truth. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. The morning of the wedding, the Valerius estate felt like a beehive that had been violently disturbed. The air was thick with the scent of expensive hairspray, lilies, and the underlying metallic tang of nervous energy. Footsteps thundered across the hardwood floors of the hallways. Caterers carrying silver trays, bridesmaids in matching silk robes fluttering like butterflies, and the distant, muffled sound of a cello being tuned in the garden below. Amidst this opulent chaos, Eleanor sat in her room, a silent island in a stormy sea. She was dressed in a charcoal silk gown that felt like armor, her silver hair pinned back with a precision that defied her age. On her lap sat the mahogany box. She knew Clara was watching. She could feel her daughter-in-law's presence lingering just outside the doorway. A predator waiting for the trap to spring. "Grandma?" A soft voice broke through the noise. Sarah stepped into the room, looking like a dream in ivory lace. The Vera Wang gown trailed behind her like a fallen cloud. And for a moment, the sight of her granddaughter's pure, radiant joy made Eleanor's heart ache with a physical sharpness. Sarah knelt by Eleanor's chair, her eyes bright. "Is it time? I've dreamed of this moment since I was a little girl." Eleanor took a slow, steadying breath. She reached out and placed the box in Sarah's trembling hands. "It is time, my darling. This is the weight of our history. Wear it with pride." Sarah opened the lid with a gasp of anticipation. But as she lifted the necklace, the expression on her face didn't shift into awe. It shifted into confusion, then a burgeoning, quiet horror. She held the piece up to the morning light filtering through the window. Instead of the deep, translucent forest green of the Valerius jade, the stones looked flat, an opaque, sickly shade of emerald that lacked any internal fire. When she moved it, it didn't chime with the heavy, melodic clink of stone on gold. It made a hollow plastic clack. "Grandma," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. It's so light. And the color, it looks different." Before Eleanor could utter a single word, Clara burst into the room like a choreographed whirlwind. "Is everything all right? We're behind schedule." She didn't wait for an answer. She lunged forward, snatching the necklace from Sarah's hands with a theatrical gasp that was loud enough to stop the bustle in the hallway. "Oh my God! Eleanor! What have you done?" Clara's scream was a signal. Within seconds, Mark appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his tie half undone. A few bridesmaids and the makeup artist hovered behind him, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. Clara turned to Mark, her face a mask of devastated pity. "Look at this, Mark. It's a fake. A plastic toy." She shook the imitation necklace in the air, the cheap gold plating glinting mockingly under the chandeliers. "I've been trying to tell you for months that something was wrong." Her mind, it's slipping further than we feared. She turned her gaze back to Eleanor, her voice dropping into a tone of weaponized compassion. "Mother, where is the real Jade? Did you hide it again? Or did you sell it to one of those pawn shops you wander past?" Eleanor remained perfectly still, her spine a straight line of defiance. She looked at her son. "Mark, look at me. Do you truly believe I would sabotage Sarah's wedding day?" Mark looked away, his jaw tightening. The months of gaslighting Clara had performed, the misplaced keys, the forgotten stove burners, the fabricated stories of Eleanor's confusion, had finally borne fruit. "Mom, you haven't been yourself. Clara found those brochures for the assisted living center in your trash last week. You said you didn't remember them, but..." "I didn't put them there, Mark," Eleanor said, her voice like ice. "Enough," Clara snapped, stepping between them. She looked at the onlookers, her eyes brimming with fake tears. "This is a tragedy. A family heirloom, gone. Replaced by a senile woman's delusion. Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry. We'll use the diamond pendant I bought. We can't let this instability ruin your day." Clara leaned in closer to Eleanor, her voice a sharp whisper that only the three of them could hear. "This was your last chance to go gracefully. Now, after the reception, we aren't just looking at assisted living. We're looking at a locked ward. You're a danger to this family's legacy." The room grew cold. Sarah was sobbing into her hands, the ivory lace of her sleeves fluttering with her tremors. Mark looked defeated, his hand resting on Clara's shoulder as if seeking stability from the very person who was dismantling his world. The whispers began in the hallway. Dementia. Poor thing, lost the jade, tragic star. Clara stood at the center of it all, the plastic necklace still gripped in her hand like a trophy. She believed the tradition was broken. She believed the old queen had been dethroned. her crown replaced by a bauble of no value. But Eleanor didn't flinch. She felt a strange, crystalline clarity. The theater of the insane grandmother had reached its climax, and it was time for the curtain to fall on the director. "You speak of legacy, Clara," Eleanor said, her voice rising, cutting through the murmurs and the sobbing until the room fell into a dead, expectant silence. "But a legacy isn't something you can steal in the dark or replace with a counterfeit. A legacy is the truth. And unlike that plastic in your hand, the truth has a very specific weight." She stood up, her movements fluid and devoid of the frailty Clara had spent months trying to project. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a judge. "Mark, Sarah. If you want to know where the Valerius Jade is, don't ask the woman who supposedly lost it. Ask the woman who has already priced the cruise she intends to buy with the proceeds." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Clara's face went from a mask of pity to a frozen sheet of white marble. The trap was no longer Eleanor's to fear. The walls of the room were starting to close in on the hunter. The silence in the room was no longer the heavy, suffocating kind that Eleanor had endured for years. It was a vacuum, a sudden absence of sound that left everyone's ears ringing. Clara's hand, still clutching the plastic imitation of the Valerius Jade, began to tremble, not with the frailty of age, but with the jagged edges of a sudden visceral fear. "What are you talking about, Mother?" Mark's voice was barely a whisper. He looked between his wife's pale face and his mother's steady gaze. "A cruise? Proceeds? You're not making sense. This is exactly what the doctor warned us about. The paranoia. Is it paranoia, Mark? Or is it a pattern?" Eleanor stepped forward, her heels clicking with a sharp, rhythmic authority on the hardwood. She ignored Clara and looked directly at her son. "You've watched me forget things for months. You've watched me become a stranger in my own home, because you chose to trust the person sharing your bed over the woman who raised you. But ask yourself, who stood to gain from my confusion?" Clara finally found her voice, though it was an octave higher than usual, brittle and defensive. "This is insane. Mark, don't listen to her. She's trying to deflect because she lost the necklace. She's attacking me to save herself." She turned to the bridesmaids, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. "Everyone out. Please. This is a private family matter. My mother-in-law is having an episode." "No one moves," Eleanor commanded. The sheer force in her voice stopped the bridesmaids in their tracks. They stayed huddled by the door, frozen by the raw drama unfolding in the bridal suite. Eleanor turned her attention back to Clara. "You played the game well, Clara. The gaslighting was subtle. A burner left on here, a misplaced set of keys there. You even left those assisted living brochures in my trash, didn't you? Hoping Mark would find them and think I was finally surrendering." Clara's face was a mask of indignity. "I don't have to stand here and be insulted by a woman who can't even remember where she put her jewelry. But I do remember, Clara. I remember everything." Eleanor reached into the deep pocket of her silk gown. She didn't pull out the jade. Instead, she pulled out a small, sleek smartphone. The one Mark had bought her for Christmas but which Clara had mocked as being too complicated for an old woman. Eleanor swiped the screen with a steady thumb. "You see, Mark, I've known for a long time that things were disappearing. Not just my memory but physical things. A silver spoon. A pair of pearl earrings. A gold watch Arthur left me. I realized that if I was going to lose my mind, I wanted to see it happening." She tapped an icon on the screen. A video file began to play. She turned the phone around so Mark and Sarah could see. The footage was grainy, tinted in the green hues of infrared night vision, but the subjects were unmistakable. It showed Eleanor's vanity, the mahogany surface gleaming under the moonlight. Then a figure entered the frame. It was Clara. The video showed her with clinical clarity, opening the vanity drawer, lifting the velvet box, and with the practiced ease of a thief, swapping the heavy jade for the plastic toy she now held in her hand. But the video didn't end there. The high-definition microphone Eleanor had installed captured Clara's voice, a soft, venomous whisper in the dark. Finally. "This pays for my Mediterranean cruise. You won't need this where you're going, Mother. A locked ward doesn't require family heirlooms." The silence that followed the video was different from the one before. It was the silence of a collapsing building. Sarah let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark stared at the screen, his face draining of color, until he looked like a ghost. He looked at the phone, then at his wife, as if he were seeing a stranger for the first time. Clara? Mark's voice was hollow, stripped of all emotion. Is that you? Clara's eyes were wide, her pupils blown with panic. Mark, listen, it's not what it looks like. I was protecting it. I thought she was going to lose it, so I put a fake there to see if she'd notice. It was a test. I was going to give the real one back. A test. Eleanor's voice was a low, dangerous hum. And the cruise? Was that a test of your travel agent's patience? You spied on me, Clara screamed, her composure finally shattering into a jagged mess of rage. She lunged toward Eleanor, her fingers clawing for the phone. You senile old bitch. You set me up. Mark stepped in between them, his large frame a barrier Clara couldn't breach. He didn't use force, but the way he looked at her, with a mixture of horror and profound disgust, was more effective than any physical blow. Don't touch her, Mark said, his voice trembling with a quiet, lethal anger. Don't you ever touch her again. Mark, honey, she's manipulating you. Clara cried, the tears now real, born of desperation. She's been planning this. She wants to drive us apart. You did that yourself, Clara, Sarah interrupted, her voice small but firm. She stepped forward, her white wedding dress rustling like dry leaves. She looked at her mother, her eyes red from crying. You stole from me. On my wedding day. You stole my grandmother's legacy, and you tried to make her look crazy so you could throw her away. I did it for us. Clara shrieked. Do you know how much this wedding cost? Do you know the debt we're in? I was trying to secure our future. Eleanor watched her daughter-in-law unravel. It was a pathetic sight, the polished, perfect Clara reduced to a screaming, greedy child. Eleanor felt no joy in it, only a profound sense of relief that the truth had finally breathed. The future isn't bought with theft, Clara, Eleanor said quietly. And a family isn't a business you can liquidate when the margins get tight. Mark turned to Eleanor, his eyes wet with shame. Mom, I didn't know. I should have listened. I should have seen. You saw what you wanted to see, Mark, Eleanor replied, her voice softening for the first time. We all did. But the tradition isn't just about the stone. It's about the truth behind it. She looked at Clara, who was now slumped against the wall, the plastic necklace still clutched in her hand like a broken toy. The victim was now the judge, and the protector was now the thief. Now, Eleanor said, her voice regaining its iron edge, there is still a wedding to attend. And Clara, you have exactly 10 minutes to tell me where the real Jade is, or the next person you'll be explaining your test to will be wearing a badge. The part ended with Clara looking down at the plastic in her hand. A cheap hollow thing, much like the life she had tried to build on the ruins of another woman's mind. The tradition had been attacked, but as Eleanor stood tall in the center of the room, it was clear that the foundation was still standing. The tension in the bridal suite didn't dissipate, it curdled. The air was thick with the scent of unmasked betrayal. And for a long moment, the only sound was Clara's ragged, uneven breathing. She looked small against the wall, her polished exterior cracked, like a porcelain doll that had been dropped onto cold stone. The plastic necklace lay on the floor between them, a pathetic reminder of how much she had been willing to destroy for the sake of a few $1,000s and a vacation. 10 minutes, Clara, Eleanor repeated. Her voice was calm, terrifyingly so. It was the voice she used decades ago when she ran the family firm. The voice that brooked no compromise and accepted no excuses. I have the video. I have the footage of you entering my room. I have the recording of your voice. If I call the police now, you won't be going to a wedding reception. You'll be going to a precinct. Clara looked at Mark, her eyes swimming with a desperate, manipulative hope. Mark, please. It's me, your wife. You're really going to let her do this? She's a bitter old woman who wants to ruin us. Mark didn't move. He didn't even blink. He looked at Clara as if she were a stranger he had accidentally met on the street and found deeply distasteful. Where is it, Clara? He asked, his voice a low guttural growl. Tell her where it is, or I'll call the police myself. The final thread of Clara's defiance snapped. Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a choked, bitter laugh. "It's in the lining of my makeup train," she spat, her voice stripped of its usual melodic charm. "In the velvet pocket under the false bottom. I was going to drop it off at the jeweler's on the way to the airport tomorrow. Happy now?" Mark didn't wait. He moved to the vanity where Clara's oversized, designer makeup case sat. He flipped it open, dumping out expensive foundations and brushes until he found the hidden seam. With a sharp tug, the lining gave way. He reached in and pulled out a small worn silk pouch, the original one. When he opened it, the room seemed to brighten. The real Valerius Jade didn't need a spotlight. Its deep, inner glow commanded the space. The weight of it was evident as Mark held it. The solid, heavy presence of real stone and 24-karat gold. Sarah let out a sob of relief. Mark walked over to his mother, his hands shaking. He held the necklace out to her, a silent offering of 1,000 unspoken apologies. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. I let her make me believe things that weren't true. I thought I was protecting you by listening to her. I thought I was being a good son." Eleanor took the necklace, the cold jade immediately warming against her palm. She looked at her son, seeing the little boy he used to be behind the tired, middle-aged face of a man who had almost lost his soul to greed. "Believing a lie doesn't make you a bad person, Mark," she said gently. "But refusing to see the truth once it's revealed, that would have been the tragedy." She turned to Sarah, who was still trembling in her white dress. Eleanor beckoned her over. "Come here, my sweet girl." As Sarah approached, Eleanor raised the necklace. The gold filigree caught the morning sun, casting dancing green shadows against Sarah's throat. With steady hands, Eleanor fastened the clasp. The weight of the jade settled against Sarah's skin, and for the first time that morning, the bride looked complete. The necklace didn't clash with her dress as Clara had predicted, it elevated it. It turned a beautiful girl into a woman carrying the strength of her ancestors. "There," Eleanor whispered, stepping back. "Now you are ready." The room remained silent for a moment, the gravity of the recovery sinking in. But the peace was short-lived. Clara, seeing the family unit reforming without her, let out a harsh, jagged sob. "So that's it? You all just move on? After what she did? She spied on me. She violated my privacy in my own home." Clara stood up, trying to regain some semblance of her former stature, though her makeup was smeared and her hair was coming loose. "This house is half mine, Mark. You can't just cast me out like a servant." "The house is mine, Clara," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through Clara's hysteria. "Arthur and I never signed it over to Mark. We gave you occupancy rights as long as you were a part of this family. But family is a word you clearly don't understand." Eleanor walked toward the door, her silk gown whispering against the floor. She stopped at the threshold and looked back at the woman who had tried to erase her. "You thought I was weak because I was quiet," Eleanor said. "You thought I was fading because I chose to be gentle. You mistook my patience for senility. That was your greatest mistake." Eleanor looked at Mark. "The guests are waiting. Sarah's groom is waiting. I suggest you handle the logistical arrangements for Clara's departure. She will not be attending the ceremony, and she will not be returning to this house." "Mark," Clara cried out, reaching for him. Mark stepped back, avoiding her touch as if it were toxic. "I'll have your things packed and sent to your sisters by tonight, Clara. Don't call me. Don't come back. We'll talk through lawyers." The bridesmaids, who had been huddled in the corner, scurried out of the room as Eleanor cleared the way. The spectacle was over, but the atmosphere had shifted from one of a funeral to one of a quiet, somber victory. Eleanor walked down the grand staircase of the estate, her hand resting lightly on the polished banister. She could hear the muffled sounds of the string quartet starting to play Pachelbel's canon in the garden. She could smell the roses and the damp earth. For the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a fortress she had successfully defended. As she reached the bottom step, she paused and looked at her reflection in the grand foyer mirror. She didn't see a confused old woman. She saw a matriarch. She saw a woman who had used the very silence her enemy had imposed on her to build a trap of her own. The tradition hadn't been broken. It had been tested, tempered in the fire of betrayal. and had emerged stronger than before. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, smoothed her charcoal silk, and walked toward the garden. There was a wedding to celebrate, a granddaughter to bless, and a future to reclaim. Behind her, the house was silent, but this time, it was the silence of a clean slate. The garden of the Valerius estate was transformed into a sanctuary of light and color. Hundreds of white roses climbed the stone trellises, their fragrance mingling with the salty breeze from the nearby coast. Guests in elegant attire moved across the lawn like pieces on a chessboard, their laughter tinkling against the backdrop of the string quartet. To any outsider, it was the picture of a perfect high society wedding. But for Eleanor, sitting in the front row, the air felt different. It felt clean. The ceremony was a blur of emotion. When Mark walked Sarah down the aisle, his face was a mask of stoic regret, but his eyes softened every time they landed on Eleanor. And Sarah was radiant. Every time she moved, the jade necklace at her throat caught the sun, flashing a deep, defiant green. It was more than a piece of jewelry now. It was a badge of truth. As the reception began under the grand white canopy, the whispers shifted. Clara's absence was the elephant in the room. The official story whispered among the guests was that the mother of the bride had been taken suddenly ill, a migraine brought on by the stress of the day. But Eleanor saw the way the bridesmaids huddled together, their eyes darting toward her with a newfound respect, and she knew the truth was already leaking out. Eleanor was sitting at her table, sipping a glass of iced tea, when Mark approached her. He looked older than he had that morning. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind the hollow exhaustion of a man who realized he had been living a lie for years. "She's gone, Mom," Mark said, sliding into the chair beside her. He didn't look at the crowd, he looked at his hands. "I took her to her sister's. I've already called a locksmith to change the codes on the house tonight. And I called the lawyer." Eleanor placed a hand over his. "It's a hard thing, Mark. To realize the person you chose doesn't have the same heart as you." "I feel like a fool," he whispered, his voice cracking. "How did I not see it? All those times she told me you were getting confused. I wanted to believe she was just being protective. I let her turn me against you because it was easier than admitting I had married someone capable of that kind of cruelty." "She didn't just lie to you, Mark. She built a world where her lies were the only truth you were allowed to hear," Eleanor replied. "Greed is a slow poison. It starts small, and by the time you notice the symptoms, the damage is done. But you woke up. That's what matters." Mark looked up at his mother, his eyes brimming with a shame he couldn't quite hide. "She's going to fight, isn't she? About the house. The money." Eleanor's gaze turned toward the dance floor, where Sarah was laughing with her new husband. "Let her fight. She's fighting with plastic, Mark. We have the jade. We have the evidence." She thought she was playing a game with an old woman who didn't know the rules. She forgot that I'm the one who wrote them. The evening progressed into a series of toasts. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he stood before the microphone. He praised Sarah's beauty and her husband's character, but then he paused. His gaze drifted to Eleanor. "I'd like to make a special toast," Mark said, his voice echoing across the garden. "To my mother, Eleanor. Today, she reminded me that traditions aren't just about things we pass down. They are about the strength it takes to protect the truth, even when it's painful. She is the heart of this family, and I am profoundly grateful for her clarity." The guests applauded, a warm rolling sound. Eleanor nodded graciously, but inside she felt a quiet, simmering resolve. The battle was won, but the aftermath was just beginning. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, Eleanor excused herself from the noise. She walked back toward the house, wanting a moment of solitude. But as she entered the foyer, the silence felt heavy again. She walked toward the small library at the back of the house, a room Clara had rarely entered because it smelled too much of old paper. Eleanor opened the heavy oak door and stopped. There, sitting in the middle of the floor, was Clara's designer suitcase, the one Mark had forgotten to take. It sat there like an unexploded bomb. Eleanor approached it slowly. She didn't want to touch it, but something caught her eye. A small, white envelope was tucked into the side pocket, addressed simply to Eleanor. With a steady hand, Eleanor opened it. "You think you've won," the note began. The handwriting was jagged, written in a hurry. Asterisk. You think you can just cut me out and go back to your traditions? But I've spent years in this house, Eleanor. I know where all the bodies are buried. The Jade was just the beginning. If I'm going down, I'm taking the Valerius name with me. Check the safe in the basement. Ask Mark about the 2018 audit. You saved your necklace, but you might have just lost your empire. Asterisk. Eleanor felt a cold shiver slide down her spine. It wasn't the fear of a victim, but the cold, calculating thrill of a soldier who realized the war wasn't over. Clara wasn't a woman who left quietly. She was a woman who burned the bridge while she was still standing on it. Eleanor slowly folded the note and tucked it into her gown. She didn't call Mark. She didn't cry. Instead, she walked to the window and looked out at the wedding guests dancing in the twilight. She looked at Sarah, wearing the jade like a shield. You're right about one thing, Clara, Eleanor whispered to the empty room. You have been in this house for years. But you never understood that the Valerius name isn't built on money or audits. It's built on me. She turned away from the window and headed toward the basement stairs. The party was still going on outside, the music thumping with a celebratory rhythm, but in the dark heart of the house, Eleanor was preparing for the final move. Clara thought she had a second act. She was about to find out that Eleanor Valerius didn't believe in sequels, only in endings. The tradition wasn't just a necklace. It was the absolute, ruthless preservation of the family. And Eleanor was ready to do whatever was necessary to ensure that when the sun rose tomorrow, there would be nothing left of Clara but ash. The basement of the Valerius estate was not the dark, damp cellar one might imagine. It was a climate-controlled vault, lined with cedar wood and steel, housing the family's private archives and a heavy, floor-to-ceiling safe that Arthur had installed 40 years ago. As Eleanor descended the stone steps, the muffled thump of the wedding music above became a distant heartbeat, a reminder of the life she was fighting to protect. She reached the safe. Her fingers, though aged, moved with ghost-like memory across the tumblers. Left to 14, right to 32, twice past 0. With a heavy mechanical clunk, the door swung open. Eleanor pulled out a thick ledger labeled 2018 audit. She sat on a small wooden stool, the cold air of the vault settling around her shoulders like a shawl. As she flipped through the pages, the bodies Clara had mentioned began to emerge from the ink. It wasn't a story of Eleanor's failure, as Clara had hoped. It was a story of Clara's long game. The audit showed a series of shell companies, small leaks of capital that had been redirected from the Valerius family trust into offshore accounts. Clara hadn't just stolen a necklace. She had been siphoning the family's lifeblood for years, creating a paper trail that, at first glance, appeared to be signed by Eleanor. You thought you were so clever, Eleanor whispered to the empty room. You thought that by mimicking my signature, you could make me the architect of my own ruin. But Clara had made one fatal mistake. She had forgotten that Eleanor Valerius never threw anything away. Eleanor reached deeper into the safe and pulled out a small, leather-bound diary from 2018. She opened it to the month of the audit. Inside were original receipts, handwritten notes from her late husband, and most importantly, a carbon copy of a letter she had sent to their bank 4 years ago, flagging unauthorized internal movements, and requesting a silent monitoring of the accounts. Eleanor hadn't been confused or senile. She had been a predator in her own right, lying in wait. She had allowed the leak to continue just long enough to see where the pipe led. She had kept the evidence locked away, waiting for the moment Clara would finally reveal her full hand. That moment was today. Eleanor gathered the documents, her heart steady. She felt a profound sense of closure. The Valerius Empire wasn't crumbling, it was merely shedding its diseased skin. She ascended the stairs, emerging from the basement just as the wedding party was reaching its crescendo. She found Mark standing on the veranda, looking out at the darkened lawn. He looked like a man who had survived a storm but lost his compass. "Mark," she said, her voice cutting through the night air. He turned, his eyes tired. "Mom, I thought you went to bed." "There is one last tradition we need to attend to," she said, handing him the folder. "The tradition of accountability." Mark read the documents in silence. His face went from confusion to shock, then finally to a cold, hard clarity. "She's been doing this since 2018? right under our noses. She thought I didn't know, Eleanor said. She thought that by making you doubt my mind, she could keep the stolen money and the house when I was eventually sent away. The note she left in her suitcase was her last attempt to blackmail me. She wanted me to think I was the criminal, so I would let her come back. Mark looked at the ledger, then at the house, and finally at his mother. What do we do now? We don't do anything, Mark. We let the law do its work. I've already sent a digital copy of these files to our attorney. By tomorrow morning, Clara won't just be facing a divorce. She'll be facing a grand jury. Mark took a long breath, the weight of the day finally settling. He looked at the garden, where Sarah was dancing her first dance as a married woman, her jade necklace shimmering like a beacon of hope. She almost destroyed us, Mom. Almost, Eleanor agreed. But the Valerius name is more than a bank account or a building. It is the ability to stand tall when everyone else expects you to fall. The next morning, the house was truly quiet. The caterers were gone, the flowers were beginning to wilt in the sun, and Sarah had left for her honeymoon. Eleanor sat in her sunroom, a cup of tea in her hand. The news had just broken. A prominent socialite had been detained for questioning regarding financial fraud. Mark entered the room, dressed in casual clothes, looking younger than he had in years. He sat down opposite her. The locksmith is finished. The house is secure. Eleanor nodded. Good. It's time we made this house a home again, don't you think? I'd like that, Mark said. He paused, looking at the empty spot on the wall where a portrait of Clara used to hang. I don't know how to thank you, Mom, for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on you. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. A mother's tradition is the hardest one to break, Mark. We forgive, we protect, and when necessary, we fight. She looked out at the old oak trees in the garden. The Jade was with Sarah, traveling across the world. A piece of home carried into a new future. The bodies were buried, the thief was gone, and the silence in the house was finally, beautifully peaceful. The tradition hadn't been broken. It had been reclaimed. And as Eleanor took a sip of her tea, she knew that the Valerius name would survive for another 100 years, carried by those who understood that some things, like honor, like truth, like a mother's love, are far more precious than stone.